It's finally time to take on the big daddy of Linux distros. Ha! This isn't a Linux distro, it's Windows 10. Not based on Linux at all, instead it's based on its very own and proprietary Windows NT kernel. Now I know this is Distro Delves and Windows 10 ain't a distro, but we've already had BSD on the show, and Windows 10 has been highly requested since the build 2002 update, so the Windows 10 installer isn't something that most end users see. I don't think it's really been updated much since Windows 7. Notice the window decorations. There are options to repair or upgrade existing Windows installs, which is handy. Windows has always had a pretty robust recovery thing built in, and most Linux distros don't have anything more than just a recovery shell. Windows 10 has several different versions, but since this is the first time having Windows 10 on the show, I went with the Home Edition. Now Windows isn't free, and you have to buy a license for it, but if you're savvy, there's all sorts of different ways you can get one for pennies or even free though. Since I need to reformat the main drive, we're doing a custom install. And of course, it doesn't display any flags or metadata on the drives, so without looking at the sizes, I'd have no idea which drive is which. The actual install process itself is pretty Spartan. It's just this install dialog and that's it. Again though, users aren't really expected to see this, so why polish it? The install process took quite a long time, and it rebooted a few times and eventually just drops into this setup thing, not dissimilar to how Pop! OS, Endless OS, and other GNOME-based distros handle it. As soon as it loads, the first thing you see is Cortana harassing you to set up your Wi-Fi and sign in. And yes, she's talking here, but I didn't record the audio, so there's nothing to hear. Once I got my Wi-Fi set up, the installer started nagging me to sign in or create a Microsoft account. If you create an offline account, you have to set up 3 additional recovery questions. I went with the defaults for most of the options here since I want to show off Windows 10 as using a close to default settings as I can. And I wouldn't normally go this deep into the installer, but since this is the first time we've had Windows here, I figure I'd go a little bit deeper than usual. So I was surprised to see that Windows doesn't have a welcome app or anything. It's just a browser with an HTML page with links to either offline or online documentation. And also notice how the display resolution is all messed up. What's up with that? This is the same NVIDIA card that I've used for almost every episode this season, so okay. I find it super lame that the first time users help page is basically MSN. If you scroll down, you'll start hitting news and all other sorts of BS. And then midway through this, my resolution just changed on me. And that's because Windows detected and automatically installed my NVIDIA drivers instead of asking me first. So the first time a user logs in, Windows trolls through the devices and hardware looking for drivers, which is fine, I guess, but why not do this during the actual install or setup? Having the resolution just change like this is a little jarring. So now that all that stuff's done, let's go ahead and take a look at the system resource usage. And I know I can get top and all that stuff, but I'm looking at this from an ordinary home user's perspective, so we're going to be looking at the task manager. And also quickly notice that the task manager doesn't show anything by default. What the hell? That's really stupid. You have to tell it to show more details. Can you hear me rolling my eyes? Anyway, at idle, Windows uses just about 2 gigabytes of memory, and the average CPU utilization is around 3%. So for funsies, let's restart and check again because we just installed drivers and stuff. So now we're back at the desktop after a fresh reboot. We open Task Manager and see that Windows is using just shy of 1.5 gigabytes of memory. And before you scoff, remember that some Linux distros with GNOME installed use well over 1 gigabyte of memory at idle. Ubuntu 20.4, Fedora 32, and Zorin OS all use over a gigabyte of memory at idle. It's obviously not quite as much as Windows here, but Windows also has a ton of ancillary processes and services running in the background. And speaking of Windows services, in the panel, I can see Windows Anti-Malware, OneDrive, and Bluetooth client, some other stuff. The calendar has a built-in integration piece, which is actually pretty cool. It's got this little tooltip to help you get started. The default panel setup also includes a really robust search widget thing and Cortana, which can do basically the same thing, but you have to be signed on to a Microsoft account to use her. Now Windows also has a multitasking view, which is very clearly inspired by how Linux desktops have been using multitasking in Expose for years. It also has a lot more features than a traditional expose effect that you'd see on other OSes, though, for better or worse. So people either love or hate the Windows 10 start menu. It's got this weird little tile thing going on that I've never really been into. It always seems like a cool idea, but I still wind up removing the tiles just because they clutter things. The start menu, though, is surprisingly customizable in ways that even the clones on Linux can't match. You can resize it, you can add to it in all sorts of different ways. I was actually impressed with the amount of styling and customization that you can do to the Windows desktop at all. I've cracked jokes in previous episodes about how Windows styling is really locked down and restrictive, but I'll admit it, I was wrong, and I didn't even get into third-party stuff like Rainmeter. The only thing that you can't really do out of the box is adjust how the panel is laid out. Like, notifications will always be on the right, the menu will always be on the left, and yeah, you can't really change that. But what you can do is make custom styles by mixing and matching like dark and light themes as well as accent colors. It makes the desktop look a bit more like you while maintaining that Windows polish, if you want to call it that, I guess. But the background selection was surprisingly lame. I remember Windows coming out with new and iconic backgrounds, but these just suck. Now, I've talked about Windows settings before, and this is the best and worst feature about Windows in my opinion. Now, let me admit, I haven't dug my paws into Windows quite like this since before making this episode, and I feel about the same about it. It's just so damn cluttered with buttons and links and embedded hyperlinks just like all over the place. Setting up Bluetooth was really weird and unintuitive, like it didn't finish, or it did finish, and I'm sitting here waiting for just something to happen. I was playing music on my phone and I was expecting it to integrate with the desktop, but it didn't. That's a really cool feature that Linux and Mac do, but apparently Windows doesn't. Setting up the printer made me feel stupid too. It's like it didn't detect my printer at first, and I had to manually add it, and then it said it was installing it, and it just sat here connecting forever. I poked around for a while, and then it just finished. I don't know, it was weird. Another thing about Windows settings is that there's these sections with extraneous dialogues for just weird stuff. Like for the mouse, there's the big boy settings in the main control center, but then there's a hyperlink that opens the legacy control panel with additional options. Why? And apparently autoplay and USB are distinct enough that they get their own settings section. Like these settings could literally be checkboxes in a dialog menu from the file browser or something. Like why do they deserve their own section in settings? It's weird. But then if you go over to the internet and data usage settings, Windows lets you set data limits and it somehow determines the overall data usage of specific applications and stuff. Like this is awesome. I could probably talk about Windows settings for an entire episode, but still I want to quickly talk about privacy settings because it's perhaps the most divisive thing about Windows. Microsoft scrapes a lot of data from its users using Windows. It started out as kind of like a, hey, it would be cool to see if people are using certain apps and for how much and for how long, to we'll log everything you do on your computer down to the keystrokes and file names. Now, there's an entire section in the settings dedicated to diagnostics, telemetry, and privacy in general, but still there's two main problems that people seem to see with this. For starters, the defaults are opt-in, which means you are giving up all of your data unless you explicitly turn it off. And the second thing is that you don't really have control over what gets sent because the descriptions can be really ambiguous and some things you can't even tell it not to collect. Some people don't care about their data privacy, and some people care enough to simply avoid Windows and Microsoft products entirely due to their policies. At the end of the day, the end user won't likely even know this data collection is happening, which can be seen as a good thing or a bad thing. But the point of this episode isn't to say it's right or wrong, but it's definitely important enough to mention. And another divisive Windows topic is updates and security in general. Starting with Windows Update, it basically helps keep your system updated and secure automatically. The keyword is automatic. For the most part, you can't stop updates from happening, especially in the Home Edition. These forced updates almost always come with forced reboots, which means you may lose progress or data if you're in the middle of something. Like if you leave a document open and it decides to reboot in the middle of the night, there's a chance it might just hose your work. And certain features aren't available for the Home Edition of Windows, but you can pay to upgrade your license right on the spot from the Microsoft Store. And the last thing I'll note here is that there's the Windows Insider program, which is kind of like a beta program. It's where you can sign up and test new or unreleased features and applications, and that makes for an excellent segue to quickly look at the Windows Subsystem for Linux, the WSL. Now the WSL is a feature for Windows that allows you to run Linux applications almost seamlessly within Windows. You install it as a feature from the legacy control panel, and then you download and install Linux distros straight from the Windows Store. The whole process of setting it up feels a little weird, but it actually works pretty well. It installs it as an application that you launch, and from it, you have your own little Linux install with access to your system and everything. It's not like a VM, but like a legit Linux install running kind of like a Windows service sort of thing. There's no way I could do the WSL justice in a regular episode like this. The things that it's capable of really warrants a video of its own because, yeah, we're talking about Windows here, not Linux running inside of Windows. So now let's talk about the disk situation. Despite installing Linux inside of Windows, Windows can't access Linux file systems like ext4 at all, which is what my external SSD uses. It also doesn't know what to do with LUKS encryption, so the internal drive is also a no-go. The USB drive with exFAT worked just fine, so I moved the archives over to it. Windows wasn't able to work with 7-zip, RAR, or even tar archive files out of the box. It seemed to detect that the tar file was compressed, but it's like I didn't know what to do with it. The zip file was fine, and an interesting thing about Windows and zip files is that Windows treats them like they're a folder. So you can actually open and edit files in the zip without having to extract it. It's kind of a weird, obscure feature. I think that it secretly extracts them to a cache or something, but it's pretty cool. And now for the media files. Some of the audio files opened in Groove Music, others opened in Windows Media Player, and some didn't work at all. And Windows Home requires you to pay for particular codecs, like for MP4 stuff. And I mean, technically you do have to pay license fees to use some of these, but damn, that just sucks. For applications, despite having Linux installed through the WSL, Windows itself can't interact with any of the Linux package formats, but that's not really surprising. It can, of course, install applications through install wizards like exes and MSI files. There's also package managers for Windows, such as Chocolatey, but since this is Windows Home and I can't possibly cover everything in one episode, we'll save the CLI installers for another time. A home user would probably install everything that they needed from the Windows Store or some random website, and honestly, the Windows Store isn't as bad as people make it out to be. The quality of apps in there aren't that bad, and there are a couple Windows exclusive games here and there too, so, I mean, it's a thing. So Windows is a bit of a mess when it comes to pre-installed apps and default apps. There are the basics, like a text editor, maybe a light word processor, an image viewer, a calculator, and those types of things. But Windows also adds some third-party apps into the mix, like Candy Crush, OneDrive, OneNote, a 3D viewer, and some mixed reality stuff. But to be fair about the application selection, some of the games aren't terrible. Windows has always come with good card games, and this Solitaire collection is no different. It's very good. Oh, and by the way, when I was launching all of these apps here, I noticed that the system started to bog down real bad, so I hopped over to the task manager and look at that. Over 80% of my CPU in use, 4.5 gigabytes of RAM. That's incredible. And before we start talking about real PC gaming, I saved the disk usage part of this episode for now. Since Windows can't work with ext4, I had to install the games locally, or try to. This wouldn't have been a problem if a fully updated Windows install didn't take up almost 30 gigabytes. I could not install GTA 5 on this thing. Even after doing what I could to reduce the disk usage, I couldn't squeeze the last couple gigabytes that I needed to install it. I had no idea Windows took up that much space. It's crazy. So I wound up formatting the SSD, and that's how I managed to install the games. Really wish I didn't have to do that, but lesson learned. On a more positive note, Windows has a built-in game mode and game bar that overlays itself on top of games kind of like Mango HUD, but it provides the performance stuff that Mango HUD does for Linux, so that's awesome. I put the performance thing in the top right corner, and as you can see, Overwatch here is heavily bottlenecked by the CPU, at least on my hardware, but still the frame rate remained high and it didn't dip or stutter like at all. And next we've got No Man's Sky, which actually stuttered pretty bad in certain places, like maybe it was loading distant objects while it was trying to calculate a collision or something, I don't know. But the game bar tool didn't like No Man's Sky at all, and it couldn't plug into the game to get the frame rate. I'm wondering if that has something to do with Vulkan? And the frame rate was okay, if not a little inconsistent. And last we've got GTA, which ran flawlessly. Look at the resource usage. That's just crazy. Wouldn't it be cool if we had a side-by-side comparison between Windows and Linux to see what the differences are? And speaking of which, a lot of Linux users, especially new ones, are previous Windows users. Or a lot of them just like to dual boot Windows and Linux together. But for the people that ditched Windows entirely, how does that affect their day-to-day workflow? There are a number of Linux distros that go out of their way to mimic Windows, specifically the look and feel of the desktop. Hopefully you saw in this video that Windows is a whole lot deeper than just the desktop. I talked about Windows settings a lot in the episode with Linux FX, and I still think that no Linux distribution has even come close to the amount of user-facing tools that Windows provides to users for configuring and changing things. And there's a ton more I didn't show in this episode, like administration tools, msconfig, and that. Windows is massive. I think it's bigger than any other Linux distribution, like, period. For better and worse. Something that surprised me about Windows is the desktop performance on this computer is astoundingly bad. Linux apparently makes this machine feel like a powerhouse for just like regular computing and stuff. Not a single distribution we've had on the show has bogged down my machine like Windows did. But yet somehow Windows is incredible for gaming, despite not being able to multitask more than like a half dozen apps at once. I guess that's probably more of a DirectX thing, doing a great job of handling the 3D stuff. Now if this were a Linux distribution, I'd say it has potential. But this is not a Linux distribution, nor is it open source. If Windows was open source, community developers would no doubt fork it and build specialized versions of Windows and versions more customized for specific applications and use cases. And I'm willing to bet that if Windows was open sourced and if people could fork it and make their own distributions of Windows, we'd have a reverse exodus. In its current state, Windows is a solid enough daily driver, but from my perspective as a Linux user, it leaves so much to be desired. And since the community can't fix or add features to Windows, the only choice users have are to wait for new features or switch to an operating system that has them.